Most people think that after 65, life starts to wind down, retirement, quiet days, and slowing dreams. But what if I told you about a man who lost everything at 65 and still managed to rebuild his entire life, opening the business of his dreams at 72? His name was Harold Jennings, a proud, hard-working man from a small town in Missouri. Harold spent most of his adult life building a stable, comfortable life. He worked as a supervisor at a local factory for over 30 years, wore the same sturdy work boots day after day, and came home each night to his wife, Carol, with the satisfaction of knowing he was providing for his family. They raised 2 kids, paid off their modest home, and enjoyed quiet Sunday dinners, roast beef, mashed potatoes, and always a slice of pie at the end. Harold wasn't a man of big dreams, but there was always one quiet wish tucked away deep inside him. Ever since he was a teenager, he'd fantasized about owning his own little hardware store, a place where neighbors could stop in not just for nails and hammers, but for a chat, a coffee, and a smile. It was a dream he talked about every now and then, usually after a long day's work, leaning back in his recliner with a cold bottle of Coca-Cola in hand. But as life often does, it pulled him in different directions. There were bills to pay, kids to raise, and always some new reason to put the dream aside. And Harold was okay with that, until everything he'd worked so hard for crumbled. At 65, just months before his planned retirement, the factory where Harold had spent his entire career shut down suddenly, the victim of a sweeping economic downer. His pension disappeared almost overnight, caught up in a corporate mess that left hundreds of workers out in the cold. To make matters worse, unexpected medical bills piled up after Carol fell ill, and before long, they were forced to sell their beloved home just to stay afloat. Harold went from having everything in place to facing an uncertain, terrifying future. He moved into a small rented apartment, traded his old Ford truck for a battered secondhand car, and stared out the window many nights wondering, how did it all fall apart so fast? But here's where the story takes a turn that will leave you wondering. How does a man, shattered by loss at 65, find the strength to rebuild, not just to survive, but to bring a lifelong dream to life at 72? If you're still here, feel free to subscribe, because Harold's journey is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what comes next. For most of his adult life, Harold Jennings had been the kind of man people could count on. Solid, dependable, and hardworking, he built a reputation in his small Missouri town as someone who never cut corners and never backed down from a hard day's work. Every morning, Harold would rise before the sun, sip a strong cup of black coffee from his worn mug, and head out the door in his sturdy work boots, ready for another shift at the local factory. He worked there for over 3 decades, climbing from a floor worker to a respected supervisor. The clang of machines, the hiss of steam, the scent of oil and metal, it was all familiar, almost comforting. His coworkers were like family, and Harold took pride in leading with fairness and integrity. There was a deep satisfaction in knowing he was providing for his wife, Carol, and their 2 kids, Mark and Susan. Life, though simple, was good. Weekends were spent tending the backyard garden, fixing up their old Ford truck, or watching baseball games on their RCA television. Sundays were reserved for family dinners, Carol's famous pot roast filling the house with its rich aroma, the table surrounded by laughter and stories of the week. Afterward, Harold would settle into his recliner with a cold Coca-Cola, watching the sun dip below the horizon. But beneath the steady rhythm of his days, there was a dream Harold kept tucked away. Ever since he was a boy, he'd been fascinated by the idea of owning a hardware store. He imagined rows of neatly stacked tools, shelves lined with jars of screws and bolts, and the friendly hum of conversation between neighbors dropping by not just to buy, but to share news and catch up. He pictured himself behind the counter, greeting everyone by name, offering advice on how to fix a leaky faucet or hang a new shelf. It was a small dream, maybe, but to Harold, It represented something bigger: independence, pride, and a legacy he could pass on. Over the years, he'd occasionally mention it to Carol, usually after a long day's work. She'd smile warmly, her eyes twinkling. "Maybe someday, Harold," she'd say, "when the time is right." And Harold believed that. He figured once he retired, he might finally have the chance to make it happen. His pension and savings were solid, his health was good, and the plan seemed simple: work hard, retire comfortably, and maybe, just maybe, turn that little dream into reality. He never imagined that everything he'd built could vanish in the blink of an eye. But for now, in those quiet, golden years leading up to retirement, Harold allowed himself to hope. He had no idea that the greatest test of his life, and the greatest triumph, was still waiting just around the corner. The year Harold turned 65 was supposed to mark the beginning of his golden years. Retirement was just around the corner, and with his pension, savings, and a lifetime of hard work behind him, he felt ready to embrace a slower, simpler life. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. It started with rumors, whispers in the break room about financial troubles, hushed conversations between managers. Harold, ever the optimist, brushed it off. The factory had seen hard times before and always pulled through. But then one Friday afternoon, everything changed. A company-wide meeting was called, and the atmosphere in the room was thick with unease. The plant manager, eyes heavy with sorrow, stood at the front of the room and delivered the news that no one wanted to hear. The factory was shutting down. Effective immediately. Pensions? Frozen. Severance? Minimal. Harold sat there, numb, staring down at his calloused hands. 30-plus years of loyalty, dedication, and sacrifice, gone in an instant. When he got home that night, Carol met him at the door, her eyes searching his face. "What's wrong, Harold?" she asked, her voice soft but worried. He sank into the nearest chair, shoulders slumped, and whispered, "It's over. The factory's closing, and so is everything we planned." They held each other in silence, the weight of the moment settling like a heavy blanket over their little home. But as hard as that blow was, life had more challenges in store. Just a few months later, Carol began to feel unwell. It started with small things: fatigue, shortness of breath, but soon escalated into something far more serious. Doctors diagnosed her with a chronic heart condition that required ongoing treatment and medication. The medical bills piled up quickly, draining what little savings they had left. Harold did everything he could to hold things together. He took on odd jobs, painting houses, fixing fences, even mowing lawns for neighbors. But no matter how hard he worked, it wasn't enough. The debts kept growing, and eventually, the unthinkable happened. They had to sell their beloved home, the place where they'd raised their children and built a lifetime of memories. Moving into a small rented apartment, Harold felt like a shell of the man he used to be. The loss of their home cut deep, but it was the look in Carol's eyes, full of quiet sorrow and unspoken fear, that haunted him most. At night, Harold would sit by the window, staring out at the dim glow of streetlights, wondering how everything had fallen apart so fast. He replayed every decision, every step, searching for answers, for something, anything, that could have changed the outcome. His dream of owning a hardware store felt laughably distant now, like a story from someone else's life. Survival had become his only goal. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a tiny ember of hope still flickered, weak and fragile, but not yet extinguished. Little did Harold know, the darkest chapters often come just before the dawn. In the months that followed the loss of their home, Harold found himself sinking into a place he had never known before, a deep, heavy sadness that clung to him like a second skin. Mornings became the hardest part. He would wake up to the pale light filtering through the curtains of their small apartment, sit on the edge of the bed, and stare at the floor for what felt like hours, his thoughts tangled in guilt and grief. Carol did her best to keep their spirits up. Even with her health challenges, She would hum softly as she made tea or fold laundry, offering Harold gentle smiles and quiet reassurances. But Harold knew the truth. He saw the worry in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. He heard the strain in her voice when she insisted, "We're going to be okay." Harold spent most of his days walking around town, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, passing by the old factory now locked up and silent. He'd stare at the faded sign, its paint peeling, and feel a sharp ache in his chest. This place had once been his pride, his purpose. Now it was just an empty shell, much like how he felt inside. Some days, Harold sat alone at the diner, nursing a single cup of coffee for hours, watching other people come and go, their lives seemingly intact. He couldn't help but wonder, had he failed? Was this really how his story was going to end? Broken, forgotten, with nothing to show for all his years of hard work? But even in the midst of that darkness, small moments of light began to appear. One chilly afternoon, Harold stopped by the library, somewhere he hadn't visited in years. He wandered aimlessly through the aisles until a book title caught his eye, Starting Over After 60. He chuckled softly to himself, shaking his head at the idea, but something made him pull it off the shelf and check it out anyway. At home, while Carol rested, Harold flipped through the pages. It wasn't a magical fix, but the stories of others who had faced hardships and found new beginnings sparked a tiny glimmer of hope deep within him. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way forward. Another small breakthrough came when a neighbor, Mr. Reynolds, asked Harold for help fixing a broken fence. Grateful for something to do, Harold spent the afternoon hammering, sawing, and sweating in the crisp autumn air. By the end of the day, the fence stood sturdy and straight, and Mr. Reynolds pressed a few folded bills into Harold's hand, smiling. "You've still got it, Harold. Don't forget that." Harold pocketed the money and walked home with a strange new feeling, a quiet pride he hadn't felt in months. He still didn't know how he was going to turn things around. But that night, as he sat by the window watching the stars appear, he whispered to himself, "Maybe this isn't the end. Maybe there's still something left to build." It was a small thought, almost too fragile to hold. But it was enough. Bit by bit, Harold's days started to change. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, no lightning bolts, no sudden miracles. But slowly, almost quietly, Harold began piecing his life back together. After fixing Mr. Reynolds' fence, word started to spread around town that Harold Jennings was handy and reliable. Soon, other neighbors came calling. Mrs. Parker needed her porch steps repaired, the Johnsons had a leaky gutter, and old Mr. Alvarez's shed door was hanging off its hinges. At first, Harold hesitated to take money for these small jobs. "I'm just glad to help," he'd say, wiping sweat from his brow. But people insisted, pressing folded bills into his hand, leaving baked goods at his door, and offering heartfelt thanks. Each little task brought not only a few extra dollars, but something much more valuable: purpose. His old toolbox, dusty and forgotten, soon became his constant companion again. He found comfort in the familiar weight of a hammer, the smooth grip of a wrench, and the satisfying clink of nails in a tin can. Working with his hands reminded Harold of who he was beneath all the loss, a man who knew how to build, to fix, to make things better. Carol watched the change in him with quiet pride. Though her health kept her mostly indoors, she'd greet him at the door after every job, asking how it went, her eyes sparkling when he shared little victories. "You're coming back to life, Harold," she said one evening as they sipped tea together. "I can see it." Harold smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't known in a long time. "One small step at a time," he replied. As weeks turned into months, Harold began to dream a little again. Nothing grand, just small hopes, like maybe replacing their battered car someday, or taking Carol out to her favorite diner without worrying about the bill. But deep inside, that old dream, the one he had carried since he was a boy, started to stir once more. One Saturday afternoon, after finishing a job at the local community center, Harold lingered by the bulletin board near the exit. Among the flyers for church picnics and bake sales was a small ad. Storefront available. Affordable rent. Perfect for small business. He stared at it for a long time, his heart thudding quietly in his chest. The idea seemed absurd. He was 70 now, far past the age most people started new ventures. And yet, the thought wouldn't let go. That evening, as he and Carol watched the sunset from their tiny balcony, Harold found himself speaking the words out loud, almost without realizing it. "Do you remember my old dream, Carol? The hardware store." Carol turned to him, her eyes soft and full of understanding. "I never forgot, Harold. Have you?" He shook his head slowly, staring at the horizon where the last light of day was fading. "No, I don't think I ever really did." For the first time in years, the impossible didn't seem quite so far away. In the days that followed, Harold couldn't stop thinking about that little flyer. He replayed the image of it in his mind over and over. The bold words, the promise of possibility. It tugged at him like an old friend he hadn't seen in years, whispering, "Remember me?" At first, he tried to dismiss it. He was 70 now. What kind of man started a business at this age? The practical voice in his head listed every obstacle. His limited savings, his aging body, the endless challenges of running a store. He told himself it was foolish to dream so big again. But no matter how hard he tried to push it down, the idea kept resurfacing stronger each time. Carol noticed the change in him. One evening, as Harold sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring at his old toolbox, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've been miles away lately," she said softly. "What's on your mind?" Harold hesitated, then finally spoke. "That storefront, the one I told you about. I keep thinking about it, Carol. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't seem to let it go." Carol smiled, her eyes filled with that familiar spark of quiet strength. "It doesn't sound crazy at all. It sounds like something you've carried in your heart for a long time." "But we're not young anymore," Harold said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Starting a business now, it's risky. What if I fail?" Carol squeezed his hand. "What if you fly?" Her words settled deep in his heart, echoing long after the conversation ended. That night, Harold lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking back to the dreams he had as a boy. The shelves lined with tools, the friendly faces of neighbors dropping by, the satisfaction of building something that mattered. The vision was as clear now as it had ever been. The next morning, Harold took a slow walk to Main Street, his eyes scanning the row of old shops until he found it, the storefront from the flyer. The windows were dusty, the paint on the door chipped and peeling, but Harold saw past all of that. In his mind's eye, he imagined it alive again, bright, welcoming, a place where the community could gather and find exactly what they needed. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and excitement. Later that day, Harold sat down with Carol and opened up his notebook, a blank page staring back at him, waiting. He wrote one simple line at the top, "Steps to open my store." He didn't know all the answers yet, and the road ahead looked steep. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that was too strong to ignore. Harold wasn't sure how, or when, or even if it would work. But one thing was certain, the dream was alive again. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. What he didn't realize was that his greatest adventure was just beginning. Once Harold made the decision, there was no turning back. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that easy had never really been part of his story. So he rolled up his sleeves, grabbed his notebook, and started mapping out every detail of what it would take to turn that dusty old storefront into the hardware store he had dreamed of for so long. First came the numbers. Harold sat at the kitchen table late into the night, scribbling down costs: rent, utilities, insurance, shelving, inventory. The totals stared back at him, heavy and intimidating. His savings were modest at best, and though he had made some extra money from odd jobs, it wasn't nearly enough to cover everything. But Harold wasn't one to give up easily. The next day, he visited the local bank, sitting across from a loan officer named Mr. Turner. Harold laid out his plan with quiet determination, every detail neatly written out. Mr. Turner listened carefully, nodding along, and at the end of the meeting, he leaned forward with a smile. "Harold, I've known you a long time. This town respects you. Let's see what we can do." That small vote of confidence lit a spark in Harold's heart. Word of Harold's plan began to spread through the community, and to his surprise, people rallied around him. Old friends and neighbors dropped by with offers of help. Mr. Reynolds volunteered to repaint the storefront. The Johnsons donated old shelving they no longer needed, and Margaret from the church brought over a batch of cookies and said, "We're all rooting for you, Harold." Even local businesses pitched in. The town's printer gave him a discount on flyers and business cards, and the sign maker offered to craft a new store sign at cost. It was as if the entire town had decided that Harold's dream belonged to all of them. Of course, there were setbacks. The plumbing inside the store was ancient and needed costly repairs. A shipment of tools Harold had ordered was delayed, pushing back his planned opening date. There were days when he felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, making him question if he'd bitten off more than he could chew. But every time he felt doubt creeping in, Carol was there with a warm cup of tea and a quiet reminder. "One step at a time, Harold. You're getting there." And slowly, the store began to transform. The peeling paint was replaced by a fresh coat of cheerful blue, the dusty windows polished until they gleamed. Shelves filled up with shiny new tools, bolts, and buckets of nails. The smell of fresh lumber and new beginnings filled the air. One evening, as Harold stood alone in the middle of his nearly finished store, he ran his hand over the smooth wood of the counter and let out a deep, contented sigh. He looked around at everything. The work, the love, the sheer willpower it had taken to get here, and whispered to himself, "It's really happening." Little did he know, the most emotional day of his life was just around the corner. The morning of the grand opening dawned bright and clear, with the kind of crisp air that seemed to hum with possibility. Harold arrived at the store before sunrise, unlocking the freshly painted door and stepping inside for a quiet moment alone before the day began. The shelves were fully stocked, the floors swept clean, and the new sign above the door, "Jennings Hardware, built to last," gleamed in the soft morning light. Harold stood at the counter, resting his hands on the cool wood, taking it all in. After everything, the factory closing, the heartbreak, the long nights of doubt, he was here, really here. A lump formed in his throat, but he quickly cleared it, reminding himself there was still work to do. By 9 a.m., people began to arrive. Friends, neighbors, and curious townsfolk trickled in, smiles wide and eyes bright with excitement. Some brought flowers, others brought handshakes and hugs. Harold, dressed in his best flannel shirt and a crisp new apron, greeted each person warmly, his heart swelling with gratitude every time someone said, "We're so proud of you, Harold." Margaret from the church handed him a bouquet of daisies. "You've given all of us hope," she said softly. "This store is more than just a business. It's a symbol of what's possible." Carol, seated near the front on a cushioned chair, beamed with pride, her eyes shining as she watched her husband move through the store, shaking hands and chatting like the shopkeeper he was always meant to be. Harold caught her gaze and smiled, tipping his cap with a playful wink. In that moment, all the hardship, all the worry, they seemed to meld away, replaced by pure joy. At noon, the mayor arrived to cut the ribbon. A small crowd gathered outside, clapping and cheering as Harold stood beside the bright red bough stretched across the door. The mayor gave a short speech, praising Harold's perseverance and dedication. "In a world where it's easy to give up," he said, "Harold Jennings showed us all the power of never letting go of a dream." With a deep breath, Harold took the giant scissors and snipped the ribbon. The crowd erupted in applause, and Harold found himself blinking back tears, overwhelmed by the love and support surrounding him. Inside, the store bustled with life. Kids marveled at the rows of shiny tools, couples picked out new paintbrushes for weekend projects, and Harold moved from aisle to aisle, offering advice and sharing stories. The air was filled with the scent of sawdust, fresh wood, and warm coffee, exactly the way Harold had always imagined it. By the end of the day, Harold was exhausted but exhilarated. As the last customer left and the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow across Main Street, Harold locked up and turned to Carol. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "You did it, Harold. You made your dream come true." And as they stood there together, hand in hand, Harold realized that this day, this moment, wasn't just about a store. It was about proving to himself and to everyone watching that it's never too late to build something beautiful. The days that followed the grand opening were a whirlwind of hard work, new faces, and quiet triumphs. Harold quickly discovered that owning a hardware store wasn't just about stocking shelves and ringing up sales. It was about being there for the people who walked through his door with hopes, frustrations, and projects of their own. Every morning, Harold unlocked the door at sunrise, greeting the early risers with a warm smile and a cheerful, "What can I help you build today?" He quickly learned who needed a simple fix and who wanted to chat, sharing stories of their own struggles and victories. The store became more than a business. It became a meeting place, a hub of connection for the entire town. Of course, there were challenges. A late shipment of lumber left him scrambling to explain delays to customers. A minor plumbing leak in the back room forced him to close early one afternoon. An ironic twist for a hardware store, Harold thought with a dry chuckle. And some days, business was slow, leaving Harold standing behind the counter, wondering if the risk he had taken would really pay off in the long run. But for every setback, there was a victory. A young couple stopped by to thank Harold for helping them pick out the right tools to repair their porch swing, something they had been putting off for months. Mr. Alvarez brought in a photo of his freshly built garden shed, proudly showing off his handiwork. And one afternoon, a little boy ran in, tugging his mother's hand, excited to buy his very first hammer and nails for a school project. "He couldn't stop talking about your store," his mother said, smiling. Those moments filled Harold's heart in ways he hadn't expected. The money mattered, of course, but what mattered even more was the sense of purpose that returned to his days. He no longer felt like a man who had lost everything. He felt like someone who had built something meaningful, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Carol, ever his biggest cheerleader, noticed the difference too. One evening, as they sat together on their tiny balcony watching the sunset, she reached for his hand. "You're glowing again, Harold," she said softly. "I haven't seen that look in your eyes in a long time." Harold squeezed her hand gently, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "I think," he said slowly, "that I finally understand what all those hard years were for. They brought me here." The store, though small, had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder to everyone in town that even after the darkest storms, there's always a chance to rebuild, to dream, and to create something lasting. And Harold knew, deep down, that his journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Looking back on everything he had been through, Harold often found himself marveling at the twists and turns of his journey. At 65, he had stood on the edge of despair, convinced that his best days were behind him. But now, years later, standing in his very own hardware store surrounded by the hum of conversation and the steady rhythm of hard work, he knew a powerful truth. Rock bottom isn't the end. Sometimes, it's the foundation for something new. Harold's store had become more than just a place to buy tools. It had become a symbol, proof that dreams don't have an expiration date, and that it's never too late to build a life you're proud of. Every time someone walked through his door with a problem to solve or a project to start, Harold felt a quiet pride swell in his chest. He wasn't just selling hammers and nails. He was offering hope, community, and a reminder that even after loss, new beginnings are always possible. One crisp autumn evening, Harold stood by the front window of his shop, watching the golden glow of sunset spill across Main Street. Carol sat nearby, her knitting needles clicking softly, a peaceful smile on her face. Harold took a deep breath, letting the moment settle into his bones. "You know," he said quietly, "if someone had told me back then that this was waiting for me, I don't think I would have believed it." Carol looked up, her eyes warm. "Sometimes we don't need to see the whole path," she replied. "We just need to take the next step." And Harold knew she was right. His story wasn't one of overnight success or perfect timing. It was a story of small steps, of showing up day after day, even when everything felt impossible. It was about holding onto a spark of hope, no matter how faint, and trusting that with time, effort, and a little faith, that spark could ignite something incredible. To anyone watching this right now, Harold's message is simple but powerful. Don't count yourself out. No matter your age, no matter how many setbacks you've faced, there's always room to rebuild. Whether your dream is big or small, whether it's something new or something you've carried quietly for years, hold on to it. Nurture it. And when the time comes, take that first brave step forward. Because as Harold's journey proves, it's never too late to build something beautiful. And now I'd love to hear from you. What dream have you been holding on to? Is there something you've always wanted to create, no matter your age? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. I know this community is full of incredible people with powerful journeys. And if Harold's story touched you today, even just a little, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Here, we celebrate resilience, hope, and the unstoppable spirit of dreamers at any age. Because it's never too late to dream.